My heroes have always been on watch lists. Not the safe ones. Not the ones everybody agrees on after they're gone. The ones who made people uncomfortable while they were still alive. The ones who spoke too clearly, moved too many people, refused to play the game. Because those kinds of people don't get celebrated in real time. They get labeled. They get watched. They get followed, recorded, infiltrated. And if necessary, silenced. In the 1960s, that kind of attention came from the most powerful law enforcement agency in the country, the FBI, under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover. They called it COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO is short for Counterintelligence Program, a secret FBI operation running from 1956 to 1971. It targeted civil rights leaders, political activists, and anyone seen as a threat to the status quo. It was a program designed to monitor, disrupt, and neutralize what Hoover called subversive movements. But if we're being honest, if Jesus of Nazareth had been alive in the 1960s, organizing the poor, challenging authority, flipping tables where money and power met, he wouldn't have been worshipped. He would have been surveilled. And he wouldn't have been alone. Because some of the most important voices of that era found themselves in the same position. Surveilled, targeted, marked. Fred Hampton was one of them, but he wasn't the only one. Today, we're going to talk about some of the others. Before the watch lists, before the letters, before the raids, there was a man, J. Edgar Hoover. He became director of the FBI in 1924, and he held that position for nearly 50 years. Through presidents, through wars, through entire generations. He wasn't elected, he wasn't accountable to the public, but his influence was everywhere. Hoover believed in order, control, and above all, he believed in identifying threats before they could grow. At first, that meant gangsters, organized crime, foreign agents. But over time, that definition began to change. Because Hoover didn't just see enemies where they existed. He began to see them everywhere. In protests, in speeches, in movements for change. To him, a voice that could unite people wasn't leadership. It was a threat. Not dissent, but danger. Not activism, but subversion. And the more influence someone had, the more dangerous they became. Especially if they didn't look like him, didn't think like him, didn't operate within the same system he trusted. The FBI warned of the rise of a black messiah who could unify and electrify the masses. Fred Hampton fit that description. And when you see enemies everywhere, you start creating them. So under his leadership, the FBI began to treat those people accordingly. Not as citizens exercising rights, but as problems to be contained, neutralized. Programs like COINTELPRO would grow out of that mindset. Surveillance became routine. Infiltration became strategy. Disruption became policy. And the line between law enforcement and political control began to blur. Hoover didn't just run an agency. He shaped a system. One that decided who was dangerous and who needed to be stopped. And once that system was in place, it didn't take long for names to start appearing on lists. Fred Hampton wasn't an outlier. He wasn't a one-off. He was part of something bigger. The Black Panther Party had been building long before Fred ever stepped into a leadership role. Founded in Oakland in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, the Panthers weren't just talking about change, they were organizing it. Armed patrols to monitor police activity, free breakfast programs for children, community health clinics, education initiatives. They weren't waiting for the system to work. They were building something alongside it. And that was the problem. Because to the federal government, and especially to Hoover, the Panthers were the greatest internal threat to the security of the United States. Not foreign enemies, not hostile governments, American citizens. Organizing, feeding people, educating people, uniting people. And perhaps most dangerous of all, inspiring people. So the FBI didn't just watch them, they targeted them. Through the program known as COINTELPRO, the goal wasn't simply surveillance, it was disruption. Agents and informants were placed inside Panther chapters. False letters were sent to create paranoia and division. Leaders were discredited, arrested, harassed. Conflicts were encouraged, sometimes manufactured. The idea was simple. If you couldn't stop the movement from the outside, you could tear it apart from within. And in city after city, that's exactly what began to happen. Raids, arrests, shootouts. A steady pressure campaign designed to exhaust the movement and isolate its leaders. Fred Hampton was one of the most effective organizers the Panthers had, which made him one of the most dangerous. And as you've already seen, that made him a target. But Fred wasn't the beginning, and he wasn't the end. And this is what that system looked like in practice. Fred Hampton wasn't the only one. The Panthers weren't the only ones. Because this wasn't about one group. It was about influence. A Baptist preacher from Atlanta, promoting nonviolence, organizing millions, while behind the scenes, he was being surveilled by the FBI, wiretapped, monitored, even sent anonymous letters suggesting he take his own life. A revolutionary, speaking about self-determination, black empowerment, watched, tracked, his organizations infiltrated, his movements disrupted. And even an artist, speaking out against war, drawing massive crowds. The FBI opened a file on him, surveilled him, and even attempted to deport him over a prior conviction while he was organizing against the Vietnam War. Different voices, different approaches, same attention. Some of those voices were silenced. Others were simply made harder to hear. One of those places the systems pressed down the hardest was on native land. In the 1960s, conditions on many American Indian reservations were beyond deplorable. Infant mortality, suicide, alcoholism and drug addiction, poverty, unemployment, housing insecurity, in many cases the worst in the United States. Some rivaled those of developing nations. And the people who were supposed to help weren't. In 1969, Native activists occupied Alcatraz Island. For 19 months they held it. And against that backdrop, a group of activists decided that they had seen enough. Men like Clyde Belcourt and Dennis Banks helped found something new. It was called the American Indian Movement, and its symbol was the American flag, flown upside down. A symbol borrowed from maritime tradition to indicate that a vessel was in distress. And others, like John Trudell and Leonard Peltier, would soon become some of its most visible voices. One of those voices, Leonard Peltier, would become one of the most controversial cases tied to that era. In 1975, a shootout on the Pine Ridge Reservation left 2 FBI agents dead. Peltier was arrested, tried, and convicted. But the case has been disputed ever since. Questions about evidence, witness testimony, and withheld information. Even some officials involved later raised concerns about how the case was handled. To some, he's a convicted killer. To others, a political prisoner and a hero. After spending decades incarcerated, while maintaining his innocence, his sentence was finally commuted in 2025 to serve the remainder at home. These attacks weren't random. They weren't isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a system, one that identified certain kinds of people and treated them the same way. Not based on violence, not based on crime, but based on influence. If you could move people, you were watched. If you could unite people, you were targeted. If you could change the direction of a conversation, you were marked. And systems like that don't always disappear. Sometimes they just change names. It didn't matter if you were a preacher, like Martin Luther King Jr., a revolutionary, like Malcolm X, an organizer, like Fred Hampton, an activist, like John Trudell or Leonard Peltier, or even an artist, like John Lennon. Different voices, different movements, same intention. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. My heroes have always been on watch lists. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were effective. If you're still here, thank you. I really enjoy researching and telling these stories, and I hope you're enjoying hearing them. As many of you know, I went to college to be a social studies teacher. That path didn't work out. But this channel, this is my classroom. If you got something out of this, drop a like. Hit subscribe. Maybe share it with someone who wants to hear stories like this. And welcome to the Underground Syllabus.